Hello, everybody, Millennium Live listeners. It's great to be back here on another episode of the Millennium Live podcast series. We have a great sponsor with us today because we're going to be talking all about empowering software innovation securely. We have a great company. It's called Sonatype. And to talk all about Sonatype and recent events happening surrounding cloud security and cybersecurity software, we have Brian Fox. He's the Chief Technology Officer and co-founder of Sonatype. Brian is a governing board member of the Open Source Security Foundation. He's a member of the Apache Software Foundation and former chair of the Apache Maven project. He's got over 20 years of experience developing and leading development of software for organizations ranging from just startups to large enterprises. It's great to have you on the podcast, Brian. Welcome to Millennium Live.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Hi, everyone.
So I want to start here. We're going to go right into supply chain. And we have a recent report that you guys put out that shows an average of 742% increase in software supply chain attacks each year for the last 3 years, dating back since 2019. That's that's a big number, not to beat around the bush here. So, what's going on here? Are there more hackers out there, or is it easier to hack? Why are cyber attacks increasing at such an alarming rate?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, we're seeing the latest evolution of a cat and mouse game, right? Network attacks were a thing that were countered to some extent by firewalls. And then people figured out how to move beyond that into social engineering attacks and these types of things. And, it was back in 2017 when I first started speaking about this rise of malicious, attacks on the supply chain. Not a lot of people were paying attention at that point, but fortunately, unfortunately, the number of them has increased to the point where people generally understand that this is an issue. SolarWinds was a great example of a highly sophisticated supply chain attack. Why are we seeing a massive rise in that? There's a study that I've been using and talking about for a while. Cybercrime as an industry was a $10.5 trillion industry in 2021. As compared to the global drug trade. So if you think of all the drugs in the world, that's a $550 billion. So the cybercrime is already dwarfing this by orders of magnitude, all of the drugs in the world. And it's predicted to grow, even more in the next couple of years, right? And so if you think about that from an investment perspective, that $10.5 trillion is what's being invested against us. That's what they're extracting. And so naturally, it's a gold rush. I think that's why we're seeing each year for the last year, this 750% increase. It's like 7,000% over the last 3 years total. It's insane.
And I think that's why you invented software supply chain management, and to help organizations figure this out and be there for them when these attacks happen. So I just want a couple more leading questions to this. How is Sonatype helping customers get a better handle on software supply chain security? And perhaps in your opinion, Brian, what are the first steps organizations should take to really protect themselves around these?
Yeah, so we started in 2008. Our first product was a repository manager for tools like Maven and NuGet and Docker and these types of things. And we pretty quickly, through working with customers, recognized that there was a gap in the information, that customers were continuing to use the versions of projects that had known vulnerabilities were often the most popular, which showed, at industry level, people didn't understand what was going on. So we started building software before it was even, SCA was even a term, long before, a decade before SBOM was a term, right? So I've seen this evolve over a number of years, but we first started by helping customers understand what's inside their software. They didn't have a good way of doing that. And at the time, even many organizations weren't using package managers. So it's not like you could just read the manifest to figure out what was in there. And we had to build techniques like binary analysis to figure out what actually was inside so that we could first produce what we now would refer to as an SBOM, and then, use a lot of techniques to be able to have data around what vulnerabilities are in it, what the license is, age, popularity, quality, and try to bring all of that back so that then, the organizations could reason about the dependencies that are in their software. So that's kind of, a snippet of what we've been doing for a long time, trying to do this in a way that's compatible with development and not a weapon against development. And so the first thing to get started, if you can't answer the question, if I told you about a new vulnerability today, could you answer the question, are we even using that component anywhere in my organization? If you can't answer that, then you also can't answer what applications specifically are we using the specific affected version of that, and how will we track the remediation? So if you can't do those things, that's the first step. And sadly, many organizations are totally unprepared for that, as evidenced by the log4j consumption. So log4j, log4shell, we're closing in on 18 months now since that, dropped on the world before Christmas of 2021. And as of, today, the world is still consuming those known vulnerable versions nearly 1/3 of the time, 30% of the time. When log4j is downloaded, it's of these known vulnerable versions 18 months later. There's no good excuse for that other than organizations don't actually know what's inside their software, and they're just continuing to use these things over and over again.
Well, you said it best. I mean, I think you kind of alluded to how, difficult it is then for, to scaling cybersecurity process like this for any size enterprise. But Sonatype is empowering fearless open source development. And so I wanted you to talk a little bit about the Sonatype platform and the ways it truly helps organizations better prepare.
Sure. So like I said, we have the binary analysis techniques to be able to tell you precisely what's inside your software. And then we provide a ton of deeply researched metadata. We found early on that the National Vulnerability Database was not complete and not precise enough for the level of automation that we were looking for. So we have to go and do extra levels of research to track very precisely where the vulnerable code is so that we can make sure we taint on only the submodules that matter. The example would be something like Spring has 80 individual components, but the NVD does not have in a coordinate system, everything would map against Spring, right? And so if you're using any one of the modules of Spring, you would get back all of the vulnerabilities of any of the modules in Spring with other tools that don't have this level of precision. So we created that level of precision because I wanted to be able to do analysis very quickly in the context of development when the developers are choosing the components. And in that context, false positives would kill you. It's the broken fire alarm or the broken car alarm. You just turn it off. And so with that data behind it and a flexible policy system, we're able to allow organizations to find guardrails that can be applied very quickly. So you don't have to wait for 6 weeks for somebody to approve the use of a component or not. We can tell you right away if it's allowed. And then one other newer part of the portfolio to address this malicious open source I was talking about is the firewall part of the platform, which sits on top of a repository manager and can defend against these known or unknown at the time malicious open source. And we have a lot of MLAI techniques that can identify that stuff on the fly.
That's great. Wow. So I do want to talk a little bit about, that it's almost been 2 years since the executive order on improving the nation's cybersecurity was announced, and talk about deadlines. They're fast approaching. So how should cybersecurity leaders, executives, and the C-suite be preparing for this in a timely fashion? Because it's coming up fast.
It's it's almost the answer to the last question, because the thing I was saying you need to do is know what's inside your software. Well, that's the SBOM. That's what the executive order is requiring organizations that sell software to the US government to be able to do. Now, the executive order in its initial form was a little vague in what an SBOM should be. In fact, it wasn't even required to be in a machine readable format. A PDF literally could be sufficient. So I see a lot of organizations getting hung up on we don't know what the format is, we don't know what the minimum standards are, and meanwhile they're still standing around and have no idea what they would put in it, even if they could be told what those standards are. So get started with that inventory. What we've found is that organizations that do this are so much better prepared for all the dimensions beyond just security. But that's how you need to be preparing for this.
No surprise that, macroeconomic headwinds are forcing many organizations to reassess their tech stacks and cut back in certain ways. So, how can cyber leaders emphasize the continued importance and investment in security, even though when budgets are tight? This is how this podcast started out, with increasing cyber attacks. So I'm sure it's as important than ever to continue the security of the enterprise.
Well, companies that do a better job of managing their supply chains, even physical ones, are more efficient. And we have studies that show that that organizations that convert and get their software supply chain under control tend to be at least 30% more efficient. Now, that could be 30% more innovation that you're piling in, against your competition. Or in today's environments, it could be 30% less that you have to spend to do the same thing. And this comes from being able to make better choices around the components, not having 80 versions of the then available 84 versions of Spring, like we've seen in at least one organization, right? Reduce the surface area, make better choices, don't have 15 different XML parsers. These things kill an organization at scale, but you can't even start to reason about that if, again, you don't know what's inside your software. So getting this under control will allow you to be much more efficient. And it shouldn't be hard to believe, but take a look at auto manufacturers. Toyota is well known for having very good control over their entire supply chain, and they're able to build more reliable, safer cars for the same cost. I mean, Walmart also famously controls their entire supply chain vertically up and down, and they use that to provide lower cost goods to consumers. So the same is true of your software. So when you're talking about how are we going to do more with less, you need to do this, and it will allow you to do more with less. That's the bottom line. It's not spend more on security just for the sake of being secure. It's get these things under control, and then actually you can spend less in many areas.
And we continue this talk about what enterprises need to do and be on the lookout for. The new National Cybersecurity Strategy calls for cybersecurity liability and holding software providers responsible. Now, how does this impact software development? I'm sure everybody's just more aware when they are, and the developers, how can organizations better prepare to mitigate this liability and become more aware of this new strategy?
Right. So the strategy is basically saying that organizations that are doing a poor job to be determined based on industry best practices. But if you fall below what are considered to be accepted practices, and your products cause harm or data loss or monetary loss or whatever, you should be held liable. Currently, contract law allows software organizations to disclaim liability or to limit to the purchase price of the software. And they're basically saying that's ridiculous. And you know what? I emphatically agree. All of those organizations I mentioned before, that are 30% of them that are still using the known vulnerable log4j, like if that leads to a data breach, the consumers should rightfully be outraged, right? I mean, take auto manufacturers and airbags, right? There were airbag problems multiple years ago. How would you feel if you bought a brand new model year 2023 car and found out it had a 2015 known vulnerable to airbag in it? You would be outraged, and you would be justified in doing so. And if that caused a loss of life, you would expect that the extra liability would be attached to that. Why should it be different from software, right? So every mature industry has gone through this transformation. 100 years ago, it was food. industry where you couldn't sue for bad practices in the food until just 100 years ago. That seems crazy, but that's what happened. Same thing with auto manufacturers. So I think we in the software industry have been living in this sort of the honeymoon phase, and because we didn't get our act together in time, time's changing. But it's the inevitable conclusion of any mature industry, as far as I'm concerned.
Huh. So I'm curious to know, Brian, if there is a common cybersecurity misconception that you wish all leaders knew and that perhaps some leaders out there don't understand.
Great question. I think that it's becoming less of an issue these days, but certainly I think there's still pockets where leaders believe that their software is nearly all created by their developers. And the reality has been true for nearly 20 years at this point, that 80 to 90% of the software in your applications comes from developers that you don't know, open source, third party, these types of things. And so for various reasons, software that's acquired outside of, say the commercial procurement process, right? When an organization buys software, it's often a huge burden, and there's contract review and technology review and tracking, and all these things happen. But none of that happens on the open source side because it's free. And so organizations and leaders maybe aren't aware that what's effectively happened is 80% of their stack has completely bypassed all the procedures and checks and balances that they have in place for their commercial side. And that's all that we're talking about here. Even back to the second question, how do you get started? Know what's in your software. Well, you probably have an asset list of all the software you buy. Why don't you have the asset list of all the things that you acquire for free and manage it the same way? So I really think that hopefully that's eye-opening to leaders that don't know that, but that would explain why all of these other shocking stats that I'm talking about, because it's kind of flying under the radar. It's not unknown to your development teams, but it may be unknown to your leadership teams.
Yeah, I agreed. So, I mean, Brian, this is so much fun talking to you. We're approaching 4 o'clock on a Thursday here in New York, but I can't let you go without asking you, one final question. What I like to do on Millennium Live is think about the future. Is a good way to end the podcast. And I think from what Sonatype is doing, just creating all these tools that are automatically blocking open source vulnerabilities and providing coverage for the vulnerable areas for all sizes, all size enterprises. Where do you see this technology going? Because from how we started the podcast about each year of the 700, nearly 750% increase in software supply chain attacks, we're going to need companies like Sonatype to continue the great work of defense. So where do you see this going in 5 years? Where do you see cybersecurity in 5 years? You could take this anywhere you want to, but might as well thought I'd ask you, Brian.
Sure. I mean, given that I've been dealing with this now, for almost 16 years, it's easy to be jaded. It's been one of these very slowly, then all at once. I think unfortunately things like solar winds and the Colonial Pipeline and Log4Shell have definitely woken people up. The SBOM mandates and the following on work from CISA, and they've been producing a lot of great guidance, has me finally optimistic that we will solve this problem. It's very late. We could have started to solve this a lot longer ago. So when I look forward to this, part of me feels like it would be great if from humanity and society and all these things that all the things I've been talking about, have to go find something else to talk about. It would be great if those things were solved. And that probably will be true to some extent. However, it's a constant cat and mouse game. When we close this door, the attackers will find a different window that's unlocked to go through. How do I predict what that is? I don't know, but I'm fairly certain that we will be continuing to play the cat and mouse game of a different, slightly alternate flavor in 5 years. But let's at least please just put this one behind us.
I agree with that too, man. Brian, it's been great chatting with you. I love hearing all about the Sonatype and just really what's going on and how leaders need to be prepared for what's ahead. It's never ending cybersecurity, and And we know that, and it's great to have these types of discussions to make sure that leaders understand. And it's great, again, learning about Sonatype and how you guys provide software supply chain management for enterprises big and small, trusted by 15 million developers. There's a reason you're on Millennium Live today. So thank you so much, Brian Fox, CTO Sonatype, for joining Millennium Live. It's great. We had a great week of cybersecurity at the Transformational CISO event this week, and really looking forward to continuing the conversation with you, Brian. So let's stay in touch.
All right. Thanks, everyone.